All right, CR, it's great to have you back on the podcast. Very excited because you also have a second book coming out, which we'll talk about at the end here.
Yeah, it's great to be back, and thank you for having me on.
Yeah, so before we even dive in today, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about where's the economy currently,
Mhm.
this magical world of inflation, which I am very sad watching people discuss inflation on the internet. Some crazy ideas out there that just blow my mind. But do you want to talk a little bit about, I mean, kind of the big elephant in the room here right now with politics going on? I mean, yesterday Trump was at a rally and he was shot in the ear, it looks like.
Mhm.
Any thoughts on that, how it will impact economic or even election outputs?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So I was looking at the prediction markets after he got shot because there's usually a rally around the flag effect, right? So after Reagan was shot, his approval rating skyrocketed. After JFK was shot, his approval rating skyrocketed, even though he didn't live through that. And so generally, these things tend to boost approval ratings, but there haven't been any polls since then. So prediction markets are your best real time information on this. And looking at those markets, there haven't been much of a change. I think there was a 1 cent change from 65 cents on Donald Trump to 66 cents. Um, and so I don't think, in terms of at least economics, there's much of a change. I'm more concerned about the state of society, given that we're at a point where presidential assassinations are happening.
Yeah. Do you think this is going to, I mean, I'm kind of thinking about this. I saw somebody post a similar thought, which was,
Mm-hmm.
this was a bad event for both sides. If you're
Mm-hmm.
against Trump, it's going to rally people behind him. If you're for Trump and he's living, right, it's going to help build the momentum. I mean, the picture with the fist coming
Yeah.
out, it was just very, very patriotic and very American of like, we're going to
Mm-hmm.
stand through this. I think, I mean, I don't know. Do you think he's so far ahead polling wise? It seems like when you look at a lot of the polls, it's not even going to matter to your point. Like the predictions aren't going to move very much. The economy, I don't think it's going to shift very much. It seems like we kind of all know it looks like Trump's going to win. I say
Mm-hmm.
that though, knowing, I could be wrong here in
I
6 months.
think it's looking like Trump's going to win, but we never know because a lot of times, like in 2016, everyone thought Hillary Clinton was going to win, and then Trump blew it out of the water, right? And we never know. And one thing that I found interesting is obviously Biden's debate performance was disastrous for his campaign. And with that debate performance, the shocking thing for me was not how much polls moved, but was how little they actually moved. And it really seems like they were codified coalitions. So almost everyone that was going to vote for Biden is probably never going to vote for Trump anyway. And many people that were going to vote for Trump are never going to vote for Biden. And so you're really only moving around at the margins here. And that what concerns me about any prediction going into this, because one thing that is true is generally the state of economy tends to be a good predictor of an election.
Hmm.
But it's very clear right now that the state of the economy and the state of how people feel about the economy are two different things. And it's also very clear that from the perspective of the broader campaign season, I am just concerned that we really won't know. And when the election happens, it's going to be another one like in 2020, where days later we're still counting ballots and someone wins a state by like 40,000 votes, which is nothing.
Yeah. Do you want to
Yeah.
talk a little bit about your point there on the state of the economy
Mm-hmm.
versus how people are actually feeling like the economy is going?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends on what indicators you think are the most important, but generally speaking, your average economist would say GDP growth's decent, unemployment's beneath the natural rate, which tends to be a very good sign. But still, many people feel as if the economy is miserable. Like, I remember there was a poll that said 30-40% of Americans believe America's in a recession right now. And even more believe America is in the worst economic time in human history, which is a remarkable claim given that the Great Depression happened. And I think in some respects, there are also reasons to believe that. Inflation is still way above the Fed's target, and rates are high relative to the last decade or so. And because of that, many people feel the tightness, and that has caused a ton of tightness across a number of markets, including housing, because no one wants to go from their current house that was cheaper, had a relatively low interest mortgage, and to a much more expensive house. Because if you look at the housing price index, it's up like 100,000, and have a mortgage that's multiple percentage points higher than the one they're currently in.
Yeah. Even the house values. I mean, I paid 333 for mine. And
Hmm.
like last year, the year before, I had neighbors selling for like 750. I know
Wow.
it blows my mind. I'm like, I couldn't afford to live here now. And now we're seeing houses now coming down, I think to like the 550s.
Hmm.
So to your point, I'm a little bit more optimistic as we're starting to see prices fall on larger items that are driven by interest rates.
Yeah, I think they're falling, and housing prices have been falling. I think the question is, are they going to return back to the mean prior to their large rise, which started during COVID but was really perpetuated by the stimulus and rates? And that's something I'm not so sure about. That would be a very large drop. Um,
Yeah.
and so I've been thinking about kind of how the large ticket items are going to respond, but largely it seems like we've managed to, and I'm saying this knowing that I'm probably going to be wrong, but most instances in which there have been inflation, generally the raise in rates tends to send us into a recession. We
Yeah.
haven't experienced a recession in that sense, and we seem to be doing relatively well compared to where everyone thought we were going to be. So I can't guarantee it, but it seems like we're in a relatively sound state right
I
now.
mean, I'm looking at house prices. I think they will come back inflation adjusted.
Hmm.
I think the American public and the average person views it in dollar values. Like I'm
Yeah.
talking, my house is 333 when I bought it, but I mean, inflation adjusted, you're probably looking 500,000, 550. And so again, where's that point at? Is it at 450? Is it at
Hmm.
480? Where's kind of the break even on that?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's probably a good bet because it seems unlikely that there are permanent supply factors driving these. And one kind of indication was the home construction index has been surging recently because they've started building a lot of new homes in response to the very strong demand pressures.
Yeah. Do you want to just start with explaining general inflation? Because I saw on the
Yeah.
internet someone was saying like, you could easily fix this. The government has infinite money. If they just printed more money, we would all have more money and then inflation would go away. And I'm scratching my head like this is the exact opposite of, this is what's causing the inflation.
Yeah, I think many people don't really think through a lot of these things. Like another one I've heard a lot of is greedflation. And one thing I've tried to explain is corporations have been about the same level of greedy throughout human history. It's roughly flat.
Yeah.
And yeah, so inflation is broadly defined by the money supply being in excess of the growth rate. And there's a very simple reason why that's true is if nominal factors would have real effects on the economy, we could print infinite money and attain infinite growth. And there's a thought experiment I like to give that I've given a few times now where you use shells as currency. So let's say you're in an economy and everyone uses shells and suddenly the next day they discover double the amount of shells that they had currently. So the money supply, which is defined by shells, has now doubled. Does that mean that the prices of goods and services are going to double? And most people would say yes. And why is that the case? And the reason is because if the prices of goods and services, assuming the supply remained the same between point A and point B, if they did not double, half the people would have all the goods and services because they'd be able to double their consumption, and the other half would starve.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and it's the underlying supply and demand dynamics haven't actually changed. It's just a little more complicated. And so if you increase the supply of something, it's going to have an effect on the demand. And when I talk about this, it's always difficult too because many people say, "Well, the data says otherwise." Your thought experiment sounds great, but the data says otherwise. And then I just pull up. I go to Fred, which is the Federal Reserve Economic Data, and then you just take measure of the money supply, you run it against inflation, you're like, wow, a 97% correlation. Who would have guessed?
Let me share this. Let me share my screen on here because we're talking about the money supply. And I think this is critical. Uh, so M1 is going to be the most liquid, cash savings. And then M2 is typically like the CDs, correct? Like CDs and things that are fairly liquid, but not quite that liquid. I don't think a lot of Americans, to your point, right? The shell experiment is the one I've tried to explain to other people too, right? If you have so many dollars and then you double it, right? Everyone's going to be wealthy. And so then everyone's going to bid up the prices for the same good. And so prices will rebalance higher. I think the disconnect is like nobody sees the government and they can see it. Like we have this chart. You can see that they printed money during these stimulus actions, and yet there's always that lag, that massive lag where it's like you don't realize how much the money supply has increased. And so
Mhm.
if you just look at the green line, which is just cash, super liquid accounts, even the blue line, M2, we go from like 2019, 2020 in here. I think it's 2020 at the census, and
Mhm.
we're magnitudes. We're like so
Yeah.
much higher on this chart. It's hard to explain to people how much of a run and how much increased dollars we have that we have to get rid of. Like the way I view it is, we have to get rid of them, right? How do you get
Mhm.
rid of these dollars? And so I think a lot of people, this is where I'd argue, I think the economy is in actually in a worse state because I think the issue is we've had so many dollars in the system for so long. Inflation has hit. They've tried to combat this with raising rates. Everyone's still been spending all that extra cash. Like I remember,
Mhm.
I think it was last year. I'm like, you know what? I make a lot of money. Like inflation's hitting. I'm feeling great. It's like I'm sure the guy on the bottom end of this, lower social status, making minimum wage, whatever. I'm sure he's just getting hammered because I'm hearing everyone
Mhm.
complain. But now we're sitting here a year later, and as we're seeing, I think inflation really kick in, and everyone's spent all these extra dollars. Now we're back to that previous state where now we're pinching pennies again because those glory days of free cash being printed had to go somewhere.
Exactly. And the thing that I think many people don't realize is you can print money, you can drive growth temporarily, but then the growth you drove will go back to normal. It'll mean revert, but the inflation will stay. And I think many people fail to realize that inflation is just a tax on poor people because rich people, they have investments, they have things that will not only keep up with inflation, but will exceed inflation and in many instances benefit from it. But it's poor people who have to consume a large portion of their income, who have very little in savings, very little investment, that are the worst hit by this.
Right. And I think part of this too is the one thing I've been irritated with most of the US here, we see minimum wage keep rising. So
Mhm.
thank goodness Texas just keeps that nice low minimum wage here. But you have people that think like if minimum wage goes up, I will make
Mhm.
more money, I will get a better standard of living, and I'll get
Yeah.
around this. And it's like to your point, right? The minimum wage employees are the ones that are making the goods and the services on the bottom of the necessities typically. You don't
Mhm.
typically see, a highly trained mechanic or something building fighter jets at Lockheed Martin making minimum wage. These are high paying jobs, right? I mean, it's a well skilled, well trained job. When you start to think about like the services, like a lot of retail jobs, fast food, those sort of jobs, you can keep raising that, but who's consuming the most? It's going to be the bottom end of the spectrum here. It's not going to be the guy that's making two, three, 400,000 a year. He can easily say, you know what? I'm not going to stop at McDonald's or whatever. I'm probably going to go out to a nice fancy restaurant anyways. And so to your point, right, it's really just it's hurting the bottom class. I think when minimum wages are going up, in my
Mhm.
mind, I think it's kind of been pushing, which we kind of look at from like 2010 on the money supply here. I think it's
Mhm.
like we are creating our own inflation in that sense that we're paying everybody more, and so we're just kind of printing dollars in a sense. And so then businesses can't afford, to take losses because they'll go out of business and stop providing goods and services and jobs. So they're raising prices. And so we're seeing kind of this inflation driven also by kind of a social policy of it feels really good. Like I'm such a good person. I want you to have a higher minimum wage. But then at the same time, it's, I talk to these people like, do you feel any better than you did 5, 10 years ago? And they're like, no, it's to your point, it's the company greed. Like that's what they think is
Mhm.
driving, unfortunately, a lot of this economic, I guess, inflation and kind of affordability is I'll talk about here in a little bit.
Yeah, and I think the minimum wage is a really difficult one to explain to people because it has such large support in the public. But most economists would tell you it's a price control, and price controls have adverse effects. And even if you don't intend them to have adverse effects, that does not change that they do have adverse effects. And one great experiment is there's been a number of large meta analyses on minimum wage, and they found consistently that minimum wage raises the cost to companies. And so it drives unemployment in one of two areas. Either they fire current employees or they choose to not hire future employees. And that has a very negative effect on the people, on specifically who minimum wage was intended to help. And while many people would like to claim that it's corporate greed, it just really doesn't show up in the data. It's not like when they raise the minimum wage, the corporation's like, I'm going to raise our profit margins now and not hire anyone. It doesn't work that way because corporations are subject to the same competitive forces as laborers are. And so if they try to do that, other people will just undercut them in prices.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've heard so the other piece that's been driving me nuts, I've seen this. People have been complaining on the internet, like companies are posting record profits and like they'll pull out one or two companies that have done well. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, somebody was complaining about how horrible Kroger is. So big grocery store chain for those of you that don't know. Um, and somebody was like complaining about this whole rant, and their groceries are more expensive and they're evil. And somebody posted their returns, and it was like last year, I think the profit was like 3.2 million, and this year it was like 2.6. So it's like, I mean, to your point, right? We're having to get competitive as rates are going up. Stores, I think, probably are increasing their competitiveness now because less people are buying goods. You're trying to get cheaper. You also know your customers are going to be upset regardless. Like if all the prices are going up in inflation, you still don't want to come back and say, yeah, that cut of steak that was 10.99 last year is going to be 14.99 this year. There's still obviously kind of that competition and trying to appease the consumer, but there's really not a lot of room for companies to kind of absorb the inflation pressures.
And that's very true. And one interesting thing I like to point out, and this is something that's often overlooked by economists because it can't be seen in aggregates. You have to really do these kind of deep microeconomic studies. But when you have inflation, because you have all this money and the sudden increase in spending activity, companies try to capture that as much as possible before inflation is priced in, because that gets them a better outcome, which is one of the reasons why inflation is bad, because it can artificially prop up companies that do not necessarily earn that propping up, right? They're not actually out competing by providing a better service, a better product. They just happen to be ahead of the curve in responding to the macroeconomic shock. And one thing I always like to emphasize, and this is to your point that the economy seems a little weaker than it was prior.
Mm-hmm.
And the graph obviously shows that with money supply coming down and rates being higher. But also, in an environment in which macroeconomic variables are taking precedent over microeconomic ones, that is a problem in and of itself because the macroeconomy should be inert and everyone should just be competing. But when macroeconomics becomes relevant, that's usually when we're in a crisis.
Yeah, that is definitely true. On this chart, what do you think the significance is here of the funds rate?
Yeah, one thing I find interesting is that you look at this, if you were to take the period from, let's say, 2004 to now, it looks as if the Fed's funds rate is at record highs or near record highs. But in actuality, if you look at the overall chart, one thing that is very clear is the Fed funds rate is just returning to the historical average. It's returning to the historical norm. And while I think there is a kind of sophisticated argument you can throw out there that maybe it's higher than R star or the natural and neutral rate that would generally prevail. I
Mhm.
think it is much harder to argue, which is what everyone on the internet is arguing, that rates are at record highs, they're destroying the economy, and that this is the norm. Because I think a lot of the people tend to forget that the low interest rates that we've been experiencing for over a decade now is the exception to the rule. It is really the exception. When you look at this graph, not common.
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out too on the comments, is this just the young crowd? Because I get like, I mean, I'm 35. So it's like I'm looking back, like, realistically, I wasn't really an adult till like 2007. And to your point, we look at this chart. Yeah, like rates are really high. Like this looks crazy. But then I start to wonder too. I mean, economically, we know people have a very short memory. Every financial crisis, right? We make the same mistakes. It's
Mhm.
similar players. I mean, it's not like it's this crazy new invention. And so I wonder too, is this a lot of this just that piece that we have forgotten, 10 years must be the average. I mean, my parents talk about getting a mortgage in the 80s and it's, 11, 12, 13%. And that was like a really good rate. And I think if you expand this chart even further, which I've looked at before, like the long-term 100-year average is like, I think 11 or 12% for
Yeah.
a mortgage. And so, yeah, we're complaining about, 7, 6, 7, 8% rate, but we're still below that long-term rate there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think many people fail to realize that because and this is just my sense of how economic actors work. There's some data that defends it, but at the end of the day, it's just my 2 cents, which is that people tend to weight whatever the most recent data is really highly. And even if they've lived very long, they still tend to weight it. So I've talked to people who are in their 40s, 50s, who still think the low rates that they were experiencing were the norm until I asked them to think, what was their first mortgage like? And then they go, oh, I've had this conversation like 3 times in the last week.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. It's hard. I think it's hard to remember and it's hard to
Mhm.
grasp. It's very easy to get caught up in the news. Like even I read stuff and I'm like, oh, this is correct. This is, like we're getting screwed. And then I start, to your point, I go to like the Fred, the federal data, and I
Mhm.
start looking and I'm like, oh, maybe I got a little too wrapped up in the emotions here and kind of the social media push behind it.
Yeah, and that's the difficulty. I always try to say it's important to like don't let social media influence your opinions. Use it, don't let it influence your opinions because ultimately there's so much hype and social media kind of operates on a sort of mob mentality
Mhm.
and that tends to lead to these sorts of arguments that don't ground themselves in any data. They just look at a meme that's nice and then that meme becomes the reality.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about how much longer you think we're going to see inflation? Do you want me to pull up the supply and demand chart
Yeah, sure.
or the labor force chart? I can pull one of these up as well. I always like the charts better because in my mind, I'm like, everyone's talking about some chart or some data. And then it's like I see it and I'm like, oh no, 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 it's a valid point. I didn't realize how bad it was.
Yeah, and I'm a big chart person to begin with because you look at a number, right? You see a gap of 20, but 20 relative to what, right? And
Yeah.
I think charts help visualize that. And so, as you can see here, you can see the difference between demand and supply in the economy as measured by the difference between nominal and real GDP. So, the gap between that is inflation. And so, we can generally say demand is too hot when inflation is substantially higher than what the Fed is targeting, and it still is, and that's where you can see the gap. And I think the Fed has been doing good initially. So in the prior chart you showed, it was very clear they were pulling back on the money supply, but then at the very end you can see it's kind of flatlining, and that is because they are attempting to do a soft landing. And while in the last like week or two I've become a little more confident that they might be able to, I still give it a 20% chance, but it's higher than the chance I was giving them prior. And I think the concern is that as they slow the money supply roll off, it's going to be harder to hit their inflation target because I've heard some people say that if you just set market expectations, you can lower inflation, and that's just not true. It's not. You have to change the money supply to change inflation. And because they've slowed down the balance sheet roll off and they've slowed down a lot of the policies that have allowed them to contract the money supply, I am concerned that the gap will still be there and they won't do enough. And when they don't do enough, they might react the other way and do a little too much.
Yeah. I have been in that camp, man, since 2022. It's
Mm-hmm.
2022. I started a job and I'm unofficially the economist, uh, making economic charts and making suggestions. And we've been predicting rates. We said rates are going to go up. And people are
Mm-hmm.
like, no, no, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. And then magically rates went up. And then this last fall, I think in like October, we submitted more charts to senior management. And I'm showing them like, we will not lower rates for all of 2024. And this is,
Mm-hmm.
fourth quarter of 2023. Some people thought I was crazy. Some people like, yeah, I think so. And that was that big talk in the Federal Reserve saying we're going to lower rates, we're going to come down, 15 basis points. We're going to, they've got this whole plan and the stock market's all giddy. They're going to make all this money and everything's going to turn around.
Mm-hmm.
And yet here we are halfway through 2024. And I think that's a good point which you made, which is even though they want to lower rates, the economy is not going to allow them to do it. You can't just lower rates and the government waves their hands and the economy does what it wants. The economy is like a wild beast. It's like they're not going to be able, I think, to lower these rates because, I mean, I would argue the same with you. That I don't think we haven't absorbed enough. We haven't gotten back to kind of that equilibrium point where we can, start maybe loosening rates. I think they're going to have to leave rates long term. I think the whole strategy we've been doing the last decade of like, let's hold it down as low as possible is not the smartest idea. I think a lot of it also comes from, we all want everyone to own a home. We all want everybody to own a car. And yet, when
Hmm.
you look at it, we're having higher defaults. And so it's like, it's fine to have low rates and make money cheap when the economy is booming because less people default. But as soon as more and more people start to default, as a bank, as a financial institution, you have to raise rates regardless what the Fed fund rate is to cut that. And for people that don't know, the Fed fund rate, which is the rate that the Fed lends out money, is kind of the base rate of money, like the cheapest rate you can get. And often funds, what we call cost of capital, we pay, 8, 9, 10, 11% for that cash, which is now a gap above the Fed funds. And so we literally cannot make a loan for a house or a card or a credit card less than that because we will lose
Hmm.
money with kind of the bad rates playing into kind of that money supply.
Yeah, and it's hard too because it the Fed can do one of two things right now. They can leave rates where they are, and then hope that they can bring down inflation by contracting credit, or they can, which I know Powell has made two or three signals recently, where he's like, well, if unemployment gets weaker, we might consider cutting earlier. And if they do that, they might actually be able to uh, a soft landing, however you define that. But my concern is that they will have just pushed out the crisis because one effect of inflation that I think many people don't consider is that for inflation becomes particularly problematic because it misallocates resources. Businesses cannot tell the difference between a change in relative prices and a change in the absolute price level. They
Right.
can't. And there's no way to because it's not as if when they print money, the price level always is statically. It moves throughout the economy. It adjusts different prices at different times. And they respond to those misallocate resources. And you have options. You can either continue to ease, you'll have higher inflation, you'll have more misallocations, and then push off the crisis, or you can take it now and then move on. And that's often the poor choice in economic history that you're forced with. It's like, do I take it now or do I try to push it off to my kids?
Yes. I think that was the big criticism of Alan Greenspan. He said there was
Mm-hmm.
a bubble. We know there's a bubble. Let's just let it pop. And then when it popped, then everyone is mad. Like, oh, we could have, done something to prevent this. And it's like, I feel from looking at a lot of the data, often we just make the crisis larger and we make it longer. And so then it ends up being a worse crisis instead of like, all right, let's just take our beating today. It's gonna suck for everybody. And then let's figure out how to move on from that instead of like, government's kind of like the mastermind puppeteer trying to figure out how do we manipulate this just to make it more palatable politically.
Exactly. And we can't really, I know people want it to be true, but everything can't be a higher high, right? Eventually you have to have a low. And I know when it talks about economic growth, everyone always says, well, if the Fed just acts correctly, we can have perpetual economic growth, no recessions. And I've heard that from non economists, not any economist that I'm aware of, but non economists very frequently. And I try to remind them that even if the Fed did everything right, we'd still have recessions. They're natural facets of an economy, no matter whether it's a market economy or socialist economy. It's just easier to see in a market economy.
That actually worries me because on the finance side, I do feel like there are a lot of people that believe in that. Like I always
Mm-hmm.
hear people say, like, okay, you put money in the stock market and the average rate of return is, and I always tell people it's like 8 to 10%.
Mm-hmm.
Now these younger generations saying, Dimitri, that's horrible. The market returns on average 25%. And I'm like, to your point, right? Not the last 10 years. I'm talking like historic averages. And I think I worry about that from the stance of we look back at older societies. I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
us think, United States is everything. There's nothing else around us. But you look back like at the Roman Empire, which was like I think 200 years. And
Mm-hmm.
again, 200 years of great technology, um, great cities, aqueducts, the concrete technology. So I worked in precast concrete for a while. The technology they had there of pouring concrete underwater, we didn't really rediscover until more of modern times. So it's kind of shocking that, but I think we're going to end up in that state where it's like it's not always going to go up.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of worry about that. And then to your point, when you get on the micro scale, we're going to have ups and downs. There is
Mm-hmm.
not going to be this nice, pretty, like optimal strategy to just smooth out life and make everybody, a winner, no matter what decision you make.
Yeah, and I always like to tell economists. So I have some econ buddies who disagree with me that like to. They don't say they can smooth out everyone, but they can smooth out most crises. And I always try to tell them, I'm not trying to be a cynic, there's just very little evidence for this. I mean, the Fed and central banks are really a last 100 years or so thing, realistically, at least in the way they currently operate. And I think it's very hard for many people to accept that just because you can have this great plan in your head about how you can neutralize all crises, it doesn't always work out because everything in life is not about solutions, it's about trade offs. And
Mhm.
when you solve one crisis, you often open up another one somewhere else.
Yeah, definitely. Do you want to talk a little bit about supply versus demand side economics here? Because I actually come from a different perspective now,
Mm-hmm.
um, which we can talk about here. Do you want to define just for us from a general economic standpoint of supply versus demand?
Yeah, so supply side economics and demand side economics, generally what is called demand side economics is the Keynesian perspective. And that's just because he happened to be the first one that became popular who said it. And the essential idea is that the issue in the economy and the solution to economic growth is to ensure that there is sufficient demand to meet the current level of supply. And the idea is that you have to stimulate demand to continue to keep up with that level of supply, and that demand in itself will create more supply. If you have enough demand, you'll create supply. And what I will say in defense of Keynes is that he actually is not as extreme on this as many people would like to believe. I've read all his works. I used to be a very dogmatic Keynesian. He really was a lot more moderate. It's a lot of the people that his works later that took it to greater extremes. And so that is the demand side. If we just stimulate demand, we'll generate economic growth. The supply side is the other side, which is if we just focus on increasing the supply, increasing economic growth, increasing our production of goods and services, we will become richer. Demand in itself will meet the level of supply because most people have known consumers, they work with them. If there's a new product that comes out, they like to buy it because they can, right? If they can afford it, they would like it. The iPhone was not a popular thing at one point in time, but then it came out and now it's a popular thing. And in the same way, that's the way a supply side person would think of it. We focus on the supply, we focus on getting more supply, more goods and services, and that's how we truly become richer.
Okay. I come at it from a third perspective. So I grew up
Okay.
learning those supply and demand side. I actually had a professor named John Littner at the University
Mm-hmm.
of Michigan. I think there's two John Littners, so it always gets confusing in economics. But he had a paper, and I don't even think he intended it to be like a point or his idea or anything, but it was just talking about how technology advances society and how you need to incorporate that into the broader models. And as the years have passed, I've thought more about it. Always feel like the supply side and the demand side is like the chicken or the egg. Like, well, if you have, I kind of view it as, supply side is like pro business, and then
Mm-hmm.
you have demand side is like pro consumer. But I feel
Sure.
like you need the consumer to buy the good from the business, but the business needs the consumer to produce the goods. And I feel like no matter what you do in the encouragement cycle, you end up in this, kind of cyclical issue of there's no solution. There's no way to really make the economy better. And then I
Mm-hmm.
start to think about United States. Why is the United States so much more dominant on GDP? And then you start to look at GDP, which is who has the most GDP. And it's not the United States as a whole, right? And you think like China or India have these massive economies. And then we start to redefine, which is we're not looking at GDP, we're looking at GDP per capita. And so I
Mm-hmm.
start to think, what makes the US so much more dominant when it's GDP per capita? And I think my conclusion or my theory behind this is I think it's technology, but I think the word technology has been tarnished and ruined in the 21st century because
Yeah.
every time I say technology, right, everyone assumes like digital, like
Mm-hmm.
wireless earbuds or like a cell phone or like a computer. But people kind of fail to realize, I mean, like you going back to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, I wrote a paper in college on I think optimization of like production lines and why this was critical for economic growth and development. And he talks about making like a pen, like a needle for like sewing like back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a simple process of taking the wire and then cutting the wire, sharpening the end, and attaching the top. And yet he argues that it makes most sense to have three separate people. One person cutting, one person sharpening, one person putting the tack on. And I think the reason the United States has been so successful as a country, along with many, ideas and the way we think about things, I think it has with that technology. Like we have found better ways to do things. And even when we look at us, people criticize us like, oh, the United States is so business focused. Like they need to do more math and, math, and they need to do more
Mm-hmm.
sciences and, they're idiots. They don't know anything. But that's why business is so beautiful here is that we allow so many people to fail. I think it's the technology piece that's truly driving the innovative growth of GDP. Now you could get back to the argument of, but how do you encourage technology? And perhaps it goes back into supply side. Well, if you, if you encourage more business development, you encourage more research, and perhaps maybe it's more tied to a supply side view than a demand side view.
Yeah, I think in essence, you're correct. There's the solo growth model, and one of the big components of that is technology is the way you improve your growth over a long period of time in the economy. But also, yeah, you're correct. It kind of ties into the supply side, but I agree it's a more sophisticated kind of third way sort of view because it's not just more goods and services, it's specifically goods and services that improve our productivity that allow us to produce more of something, right? Because I think often technology works as a and you can correct me if you disagree, but my historical knowledge of the use of the word technology is that it's often used as a substitute for capital goods. Technology is capital goods because they're goods that produce consumer goods that specifically enhance your productivity along the way. And in essence, the idea that I think is the true driver of economic growth, and obviously taken to an extreme, it won't work, but as a general rule, it's the primary driver, is the idea that if we continue to build this technology using your word, we will continue to incentivize it. We will move a lot faster because it's really productivity and our ability to produce stuff that makes us strong and it makes the growth rate strong. It is not our ability to consume stuff, certainly, that makes us strong.
Yes. Do you not see though that I guess I view technology as kind of two parts. Going
Okay.
back to traditional economics, you have capital and then you have
Mm-hmm.
labor. I think kind of in the Adam Smith example of making the pen, I think it's not even that you have a new set of capital. I think even like the training and the education and the knowledge itself is kind of a labor distinction. I don't know how
Mm-hmm.
you would classify that, but I'd probably argue it's kind of a two classes, right? Capital and then a labor half of that as well.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I actually am, and I'll admit I'm in the minority here amongst economists, am one of the number of economists that reject capital as a distinctive factor of production. And I swear I have a good reason for this. It's that,
I've not heard this, so let's hear your case.
so this is, I'm not the first economist to say this. I think Murray Rothbard beat me like 40, 50 years before I was ever born. Uh, but the essential idea behind this is that if you go back to prior anything existing, right?
Hmm.
What is capital? Define capital. And when you ask people this, there's not a thing called capital. Capital is the accumulation of land and labor over time. So prior to money existing, your capital was the accumulation of crops you would do if you were a farmer. That becomes capital. And so it only became a distinctive factor of production as a result of the other two factors. And I will admit, you can disagree with me, this is a minority position, but that is my current perspective on it.
I mean, I'd argue too, you need military.
Mm-hmm.
Now going into a more modern society, right? To your point, let's say there's land, which always people get up in arms about, especially the United States. But you think about, right, the land is no one really owns it. I mean, we do. We own it in the sense of, I think, a military stance. Like I own the property I sit on because the city and state and federal police of the United States say that I own it in the legal system. But more specifically, right, it's because our military power puts borders in place and says, this is the United States. No one else is allowed to come in and out. And I think, kind of to your point, I have actually struggled quite a bit as an economist thinking about capital and labor. And then I get really uneasy because I start to get into like, maybe it's just labor. And then does that make me a Marxist? Because Marx started to argue we don't even need capital and we don't really own anything. And I think there's points to it, but I think in a way, perhaps there's a natural law of ownership even if it's something simple like, okay, we live in clans and it's like family units and you're cave people, I think you still provide some sort of aggressive physical behavior, some sort of military internally that defines the ownership. But again, it's a very modernized thing now when we start to scale safety and legal systems and military kind of personnel up to a much larger scale.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. One issue prior to the establishments of the states that we knew was that you can't really protect your property rights from others, and you need that. implementive force to kind of ensure that it happens. Because while I'd like to believe that out of the goodness of people's hearts they won't steal my stuff, you know, I've had stuff stolen before. I can tell you it happened, and so you have to have some way of actually punishing those infractions. And in the sense of capital, right? It is not. I always try to explain to Marxists that it's not capital that makes what is often called capitalism works. It's ideas, and this was put forward by Deirdre McCloskey, who wrote a whole series of very long books on this. And the essence of it is that it's really the capital just enables people to have enough savings to invest in these time-consuming projects that often not only take a ton of time, but take a ton of capital, just raw resources to actually do and manifest their ideas. And the issues, let's say you took away that capital and everyone just consumed their money, no one reinvested. Where would people be able to invest in the technology to build trains or laptops or the Model T? It's because we have capital that enables us to do this stuff, but it is not the capital that is actually making us rich. It's the fact that we can fund people's ideas and allow them go through the process of trial and error within the market to find what works and what doesn't.
Right. And I think even today now it's even more clear. I think there's an easy way to track it. So I like to view it more like social capital. Like I do
Mm-hmm.
something good for you, and then you're like, okay, I'll do something good in return. And we like have an unofficial, essentially bank of social capital. But even if you think
Mm-hmm.
about this in dollars today, right? No one gives me a dollar when I work. Like no one's physically handing me a dollar. It's like I go to work, I put in my 40, 50, 60 hour week, and then they say, Dimitri, you did a good job. We're going to put money into an account somewhere. And it's literally just a number in a computer being stored in memory that says you own X amount of units. And then I'd argue those dollars really are just representations of labor, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's how many you're just tracking my hours and converted it into the dollar wages that we have accumulated over time.
Yeah, Walter Williams had a great analogy that he used in his economics class where he described the wage you receive as certificates of performance, right? They're
Yeah.
essentially saying you did your job, you did the labor, now you get money in return. But it does not necessarily mean that all labor is inherently valuable, right? Like I could easily go into a porta potty, scoop out whatever's in there, throw it on a piece of art, and theoretically someone might buy that and it might have some value. But in practice, I assume most people of sound mind and body would probably not buy that. But that is labor. I've created value technically because I've put my labor into it, but it doesn't really have value because value ultimately comes from what people demand. And that is the fundamental law of demand in economics. It's not labor that created that.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, I wish more people would understand this because, so if anyone knows my general podcast and, YouTube channel is trying to tell people how to build careers in quantitative finance. It often spills into economics, computer science, and other fields, but it's trying to understand like, how do you increase your value? And I think that's what people are missing is they often say, well, I do the same job as everybody else. I should get the same pay as everybody else. It's like, but there's value and there's technology and there's learning. And like I guess the easiest example is I worked construction and you have two guys side by side doing the exact same task. One guy'd be done in 4 hours, one guy'd be done in 8 hours. And so you think about this from a consumer perspective, which would be your employer, they're consuming your labor. Who would you rather pay? The guy doing it in 4 hours or the guy doing it in 8 hours? And more specifically, you start to get into this, negotiation of price, which is okay, if they're both paid, I don't know, $15 an hour, I'm always going to pay the guy that's doing it in 4 hours. And then obviously market demand is going to drive it. So I'm going to say, let's pay the guy $17 an hour, 18, 19, 20.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that's 30 or less is going to be the same or better than the second guy.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also interesting, right? Because you could use that same example. Say you have one construction guy who does it in 4 hours, one who does it in 8 hours, but the guy who does it in 4 hours does a terrible job and you have to redo it, right?
Yeah.
Just because he put labor into it doesn't make it valuable. It might have been he actually made it worse off by putting labor into it. It's
Yeah.
really that the work was not only done, but that it was productive and done in an efficient manner.
Yeah. Do you think in modern times with this, I guess one of my struggles, I think, is we are losing this value. I mean, we are
Mm-hmm.
talking about this as this is like common sense. And yet I remember taking my economics 101 class. And I remember just these simple ideas being taught. And I remember just being like mind blown. I was like, oh my gosh, I've never thought about how common sense this is, how supply and demand, like you always hear supply and demand, like everybody hears it. but I don't think people really grasp kind of these ideas of how the economy works here. Uh, and I think part of it, I think we're either losing or perhaps we've never taught good economics at a societal level to help the average consumer one manage personal finances, which blows my mind. They don't teach this in school as much as they should. And then also like not even understanding how to vote economically because you
Mhm.
don't understand the government. And one of my big struggles lately has been trying to explain to people the government is really not that different than how you balance your personal finances. And so it's like, I don't know how you get to that point of training and educating and bringing people that full circle of like, this really isn't that complicated. I mean, we could go down the rabbit holes, right, of theory and tech
Yeah.
and data, and you can get complicated, but I don't know how you get the general public to a point where they understand kind of those core concepts.
Yeah, and I don't know either. One issue in economics, right, is even if we all agree on what the microeconomics says, there will still be people who phrase it in a certain way to get a particular result.
Mhm.
And I've had this issue in two ways. One is just straight up bias. So, for example, they might acknowledge minimum wage causes unemployment, but they'll try to make up some uh, long term benefit that's obtained from it that just doesn't really play out in the data, but they're like, it's theoretically there. And that was a debate I had with a former professor of mine. And I just didn't think their work was ethical because they couldn't even prove it empirically. They had
Yeah.
no data. Another one is that many people will confuse political neutrality for objectivity. And I try to stay as politically neutral as possible, but also many people will not want to say certain things because they'll assume that people will assume they're on the other side and they don't want to be associated with that side because that side's icky. And I think that creates a massive uh, perverse incentive because then professors will try to perpetuate a particular narrative when they're teaching economics. And that in itself is a problem. And so I've wanted to just say we can teach more economics. And I think that would just be generally good for like personal finance and stuff like that. But I am not sure that it would help in terms of understanding because I find many professors, even though I've liked many of my professors, have
Mhm.
preferred their political biases over the actual fact of the matter. And I don't know a way that you can effectively check that, at least within the social sciences.
That is an excellent point. And I can vouch for that as well because I have felt the same way where I've liked probably almost all of my teachers. And I have had teachers who are very Keynesian, socialism is much better
Mm-hmm.
than current state. I've met people, I've never had a professor who is a communist, but I've met individuals from China who actually were economists who were communists, which is quite interesting to have those discussions. And then I've also had, more of like the classical, never really had a Austrian teacher, which is
Yeah.
quite interesting because I did more identify with being Austrian economist than anything else. But I see the struggle. I don't know how you teach that, how you get to that. I think economics is one of those fields I love it and I absolutely hate it because we're one of the only fields that doesn't mind like crapping on everybody else and telling them like you're all idiots and no one knows anything. We do it publicly. This isn't even like
Yeah.
like two snooty professors behind closed doors. It's like people are doing it on Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg TV and the news and everything. Even presidents arguing over economic policy here. So yeah, I think that's a struggle. I don't know how you go about teaching that.
Yeah, and I've thought a lot about this. I think basically, and this is just my opinion, I think we need to be very rigorous about methodological standards. That's my best idea currently, which is I think most people would agree with what Milton Friedman wrote in Essays in Positive Economics. That's the book where he laid out kind of the essential positivist methodology that's used in every other science and just applied it to economics. And I think if we were more rigorous about methodology, it'd work. But I think well, economics has done a good job eliminating a lot of people from the discipline that weren't rigorous, right? So people that were still into the labor theory of value and stuff like that. They've been very good at policing people that just wouldn't accept what the data was telling them. I think we still have a ways to go in terms of just being rigorous enough. Like I've one thing I've experienced personally is effect sizes. If you don't accept an effect size in one instance, you can't say it's sufficient in another instance unless you have a good reason. And often they'll be like, oh, well, it makes sense here, but it doesn't make sense here. And I think that is like one form of like policing that I believe economic could do better, but I don't know a way of actually enforcing that I could have any hand in.
Yeah. That is a good point. I worry too because I've worked with the science communities, and often they think that you could make it scientific. But
Mhm.
often too, humans are so I always say unpredictable. I don't want to say unpredictable. The masses are predictable, but you're right. There's always these weird outliers. There's always future trends and products and
Mhm.
demands for odd products. Or maybe someone's created some odd product and then everyone had to have this weird product. Uh, but I don't know how you would go about getting even to a scientific state of it. I think economics is actually harder to study than hard sciences because we can't come up with an idea and then we go, okay, we're going to test it because often, right, it's an unethical dilemma. Like, let's create two states, and we're going to do one policy on one state of people and one policy on another state of people, and then in 10 years we'll see this one state was significantly wealthier, and now these people suffered for 10 years and now are living in absolute poverty. Yeah, I don't know how you get around. It's such a challenging field in the sense that it's not as hard. Like you can't feel the science as you can with, other things like geology or chemistry or physics or something else.
Yeah, and I think there's 2 points to that. One is that's obviously true, which is why economics is actually often where more of the advanced statistical techniques have been coming out of for the last like 40, 50 years. Like Granger causality, for example. That is something that came from economists. And that those tools come out of there because you can use them to approximate a real experiment, even though you can't run one. And I think the other real benefit is using natural experiments. So North versus South Korea, right? You have a very clear experiment. One did a market economy, one did a communist economy, and the odds were in favor of North Korea. They had most of the resources on the peninsula.
Hmm.
And so you can see the outcomes and kind of draw conclusions from that. And while you'll never have the same level of certainty as physicists have, you can have a balance of probability. And many people don't like when I say that because it sounds so uncertain. But what I like to point out is we're never certain in any science.
Yeah.
Never. You can always be proven wrong in the future. For a long time, people really thought the Earth was the center of the universe. And you know what? They ended up being wrong. They were certain about it, but they were still wrong. And the science is you always can be disproven, and you can never prove that you've accounted for every possible confounding variable. There is always the option that there is another confounding variable that's messing up your experiment. And so, given those two realities, you always have to make a balance of probability argument, even in hard sciences. And what I like to say is in soft sciences, maybe the balance of probability is a little less certain, but it's still the same underlying framework. And that's, I think, the point Milton Friedman has tried to make throughout his career, which is that economics is still a science. It's just not a science to the same level of certainty that we would have with a physics or mathematics or biology. And I would also like to say that it's important to distinguish between like economics and other social sciences, which do a lot less experimentation.
Yeah. I could see that. Yeah, it's an interesting problem. I just feel like if people had more of a grasp on it, especially
Mm-hmm.
from this affordability stance here and the inflationary pressures we're seeing, I think often they forget that like it's just basic finance. Like you make X
Mm-hmm.
amount of dollars, you spend this much, and if you have extra, you made a profit and you'll be better off. If you spend more than you make, you're going to be in debt and capital here. And I think
Mm-hmm.
part of this too comes from the Keynesian side. I think they've over pushed the spending portion of it. We are a very consumer-based society. And yet, as we're kind of seeing businesses and the government now, I get more and more concerned with the debt every year, the federal debt. I think I just wish more people would look at this like, okay, United States is this credit card spending like crazy irresponsible individual. Like maybe even though they're spending it perhaps on good things that you agree with, we need to start kind of rolling these back into a balanced budget. Because I mean, realistically, the way I view it is the government's borrowing money from China, Japan,
Mm-hmm.
and other countries. Then we give it to the US people in many ways, projects, and we build roads and bridges and social programs and all that. And then we benefit from it and we consume it, but we're just not paying it back to anybody. And somehow we think it's not going to come full circle on like a due date.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you. It's There's actually a great book called Democracy and Deficit. Have you read it before?
No, I haven't. Let me
So,
take a
okay,
note.
yeah, yeah, I can send you the name after this,
Okay.
but it was written by James Buchanan, not the president, the guy who won a prize in economics. And he wrote a book, and it's about the political consequences of Lord Keynes' legacy. And his essential argument was what you said, which is it gave a rationale for deficit spending. And even though Keynes favored balanced budgets in times of peace, he's like, the issue is you gave them the rationale for deficits to begin with, and they'll just always claim that they need to just do it one more time and one more time. And his argument was that even though Keynes had good ideas, there were intellectual consequences to those ideas. And those intellectual consequences are something that we haven't been able to escape from. And I think that's, in essence, what you were saying. And I think it's definitely correct.
Yeah, I mean, let me pull up. I have this chart here. So we have this chart, which is, I think I can print the link at the end. It's New York federal housing debt, realistic debt. It's looking at the percentage of debt everybody holds. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the big lies, which I think it's on this chart. I think this is a huge lie. I hate seeing these charts. It's always on like some fancy, I don't know what this is from, how much .net or something. They always show the percentage change. And so they make this big deal about it. So this is the chart that gets sold a lot to people, which is, credit card debts are small, mortgages are really not that large. It's student loan debt that's killing us, which I agree
Mm-hmm.
most people probably should not be wasting so much time in college that don't have aspirations to go down that path. It just seems like this weird check the box mentality. But then when you look at the actual debt in trillions of dollars, I think it's from like 2003 to 2019, it's of course your mortgage. Like the mortgage is this huge thing that everybody wants to buy. Um, Everyone keeps saying student debt is huge. You look at it, it's the red. I mean, it's 6% now, which is big, but nowhere near 68% of the mortgage here. And the concerning part of this as well is that you see this upward trend even since 2003, where it's like our debt is growing and it's growing. And going back to those other charts we were talking about with the Fed funds rate, my concern is I think we've stuck in this Keynesian loop where it's like we keep spending and spending, and now everybody's standard of living is significantly better, even though many would argue it's not. I mean, I would argue we don't need $1,000 cell phone, but most of us have $1,000 cell phone. I mean, I don't know, a home phone back in the day on the wall was $20, $30,
Mm-hmm.
something very cheap. But I think we look at this as two separate things, right? The government can just print more money, which, as we've been talking about, that's not an option. Like you did
Mm-hmm.
the stimulus, we have inflation, the economy's reacting, it's out of control of either political party. But how do you balance this down and reduce the debt? Because both on the personal level, which is like right here, the affordability, which I work on in the auto loan space here, is how do you afford a vehicle, or how do you afford a house now with a 7, 8, 10, 12% interest rate? But one of the odd trends we've seen in the auto space is that the manufacturers went from producing a range of cars. So you had cheap cars everyone could afford as a daily driver, and then you had ridiculous luxury cars that had leather seats and, ingrained wood laid like wood and super fancy products for, 50, 60, 70,000. And over, I don't know if it's been like the last 20 years here, we see a shift. Now manufacturers realized we can now make mainly luxury cars and everyone will buy them. And it blows my mind. I had someone, there are a few people that purchased cars that were like 80,000. Another guy bought a truck, a fancy truck for 130,000. And I mean, if you can afford it, go for it. Like whatever. But I think that affordability piece here and that Keynesian driver, both on the federal level as well as the consumer level, has just been really damaging on the fact that we're stuck in like this credit card, strung out piece here where we all have so much debt and we can't get rid of the debt. And yet we think the solution is like pay us more minimum wage, lower interest rates, like someone's going to pay it. And I don't think we realize a lot of that's actually coming from abroad as people are actually financing kind of this consumer behavior and consumer habits here.
Yeah, and the big issue that I think many people, to your point, don't realize is this actually a flaw in demand side economics. It's that they always want to stimulate more and more consumption, and then people price in that consumption as the norm.
Yeah.
And then because they price it in as the norm, that's what they're going to continue until the real financial constraints start kicking in. And I think as it pertains to federal debt, I think the issue has always been that the optimal policy is people want to both pay less taxes but experience more government programs. And they want both. And you can't have both. You can either have less of both or more of both, but you can't have both. And because we are in such a polarized moment, I think it is very hard to get consensus because many people will say there's never been consensus on the debt, but that's just not true. Bill Clinton wanted to bring down the national debt, even though he's from the party that generally wants to spend more and raise more taxes, right? He wanted to bring down the national debt. And so I think the issue is because when you're in a hyper polarized moment, people just stop caring about these small things that really matter. Debt matters. But the thing is, when you really want a bunch of these programs, you start going, hey, let's just get them done. Hope the other party can't repeal them. And then we'll worry about paying for it later. And the other party does the exact same thing. They'll cut taxes, not worry about how to fund any more of the spending. And then they'll go, oh, well, we'll worry about how to fund that later.
Yes. I watched a video recently, I think it was like on CNBC, and it was the Trump plan versus the budget versus the Biden budget. And it was like, exactly what you're saying, right? They're going to decrease taxes for the Republicans. They're going to decrease taxes. They want to decrease some programs, of course, not the programs they support. And then on the other side, it was, oh, we're going to cater to the poor and we're going to save all of you. But we want to increase spending on all these different projects. But to finance that, we're going to tax all these wealthy people extra money. And to your point, it's like everyone thinks that it sounds good on paper, like, oh, yeah, they're going to balance the budget. But when you looked at both plans, the deficit went up. So, I mean, it's like having an open checkbook. Like, all right, I want your vote. What would you like on this, on your new government here? Okay, you want free money, no job. Like, it just sounds ridiculous, but it's a bad, I think, cycle we've been stuck in, both politically and I think even on the consumer level, right? It's hard for people to say, like, hey, I want a politician to reduce this. And yes, I want all my programs, but you're right. Maybe we should make a 20% cut on a lot of these fundings to get us back to somewhere more balanced, maybe even in a long run, right? We're not going to fix this overnight, but maybe in a 20, 30-year plan here, a political party actually figured out how to, do politics a little better and a little more economics. Maybe we could balance that in a 20 to 30-year kind of plan.
Yeah, and I'm usually like a pretty hard-headed realist when it comes to the thing, but my long-term idealist perspective is I hope we can get a balanced budget amendment through. I really think that'd be for the good of the country because then it doesn't become a responsibility of either party because whoever balances the budget's going to take the brunt of it because they're going to have to either cut programs that people really like because many people don't realize that it's Social Security and Medicare that are the real driver of most of these things. And then the military is right behind it. And all three of those are broadly popular spending priorities. And if you have to cut one of those, you're going to be screwed. But also, if you raise taxes to fund those at their current level, many people will also be unhappy about that. And whoever does that's going to pay a massive political cost. And so if we had a balanced budget amendment, let's say you have to balance the budget every 10 years, whoever happens to be in charge in the 10 years, whichever party it is, just has to balance it. They don't get a choice. And I think that would really turn down the partisan fervor and make people prioritize the interests of the country more so than the interests of what they think the majority of people want.
Do you ever think that federal government has just gotten too large? I always wish that
Oh,
we would go
yeah.
back. I mean, I don't know your stance, but as a libertarian,
Yeah.
I wish we would say, you know what? Instead of doing this at the federal level, which would be a federal budget,
Mm-hmm.
let's get rid of that budget 100% and then move it to a state level. And then you get more buy-in. I guess you get more uniqueness, which is a pro and a con, depending how you want to look at it. But I think often that might be a better solution than I feel like a lot of programs keep getting like elevated, like, oh, it's city program, then it's a state program, then it's like a regional program, then finally it's like, oh, we'll have the federal government do everything.
Yeah, I think government's definitely too big. And I think it would benefit us to move more to the states because these states are laboratories of democracy. They can all try different programs, and whichever programs people like, they can move their companies there and their houses and their families. And then the ones they don't, they can move out of. And I think that is a better system, broadly speaking. I think there are still some things that are more functionally done on a federal level. Like,
Mhm.
and again, this is a debate on what people think the government should be doing to begin with. But if we are going to have a number of like welfare programs and stuff like that, those tend to be just more efficiently run if done on a federal level, if it's done by the government to begin with. However, I think, as a general rule, deferring things to the states is more beneficial long term, but I doubt we're going to get to that point. And the issue is ever since uh, and I'm blanking on the name of the Supreme Court case right now, but there was a Supreme Court case that basically expanded the meaning of interstate commerce. And ever since that case, the federal government has done a lot more than what it historically has, because many people seem to forget that the Constitution really does give a very small list of things the federal government can legally do.
Yeah.
And ever since interstate commerce has expanded quite greatly, and specifically the definition of interstate commerce, the government has just done more. And I think many people have appealed to the federal government more. For example, it's not, oh, I want people in my state to pay for this because they know people will leave if they try to do that. So they go, oh, well, I want the federal government to do that. So they have to leave the country to get away from it. And I'm very concerned about that. And I think that actually has had a massive effect on our polarization because now it's not, I do my thing in Texas, you do your thing in California. It is now, I do my thing, but no, it has to be on the federal government and you have to follow it. And it's important that I have power and I have all the administration because if you have power, I get none of what I want. And I think that has done terrible things to the cohesion of the United States.
I can see that. I've never really thought of that. I mean, I've been entertaining watching California fall into shreds here the last 5 years. I mean, I moved to New York. New York's nice. It's fine. Lived in New Jersey. Gun laws are awful. The taxes are awful. You don't have safety and you can't raise kids in a well system. I didn't want to pay for private school. And it's just the commute was a pain. I was debating on moving out even further into New Jersey so I could get a house instead of living, right across from Manhattan. But then being in Texas now, I'm like, you pay a lot of property tax. Like that's how it is. But that was a nice state level decision to make. And I think, yeah, I never really viewed it that way, but I think that you're right. I think if we had more state driven decisions and more state programs, people would distribute where they wanted to live. And then people would be happier because you're not, the guy in California and New York aren't telling me as a Texan what to do, and the Texans aren't telling California what to do. And if, California runs it into the ground, like, good luck. Like, you know.
Yeah, and I'll give a good example of this in the other direction, right? I had a friend who lived in Dallas, and he recently moved to Boston because he wanted two things. One is he wanted a more vibrant arts district, right? And the second was he wanted public transportation, and he knew he was going to pay more to be here, and he made that choice. And I think that's fine. You make whatever choice you're comfortable with. I currently live in Massachusetts. I like it here, but you make whatever choice you are comfortable with, and then each person can kind of do their own thing without interfering on other people. And then on the moments of actual national unity, like when we actually have an existential threat, we can come together much easier because we're not worried about who controls the government at this given time. And I've thought about this a lot, and I think that would be one good solution, but I have no way that we can get there because it would require us to agree to give it back to the states. And I think whoever's in charge will not want to give it back to the states because they can now impose their agenda on everyone else.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I even feel now like on my YouTube channel, if I like am very pro-American, then people will automatically assume like, oh, you're pro this or pro that. And like the name calling happens. And I get it from those in other countries. Like, whatever, you're from Europe and you think your country's better than ours, like pat on the back. But at the same time, I think even in the US, it's become like a taboo topic, like, don't like, I guess, different circles as well. So I work in finance and banking. It's kind of taboo. People don't want to hear about it. I think on the more blue collar level, when I worked like construction and manufacturing, it was very exciting. People had the flags on like their welders and on like their helmets and their safety gear. We are very proud to be Americans, but I think we have lost a lot of that kind of nationality of like, we are one country. Yeah, I think a lot of people are dumb and I don't agree with you. And we have all these differences. But at the end of the day, we're all still Americans and we all still live here. And we all still want the best for our kids and our country and kind of our families.
Yeah, and I've always warned people against assuming these sorts of things because one thing I've always pointed out is my economic views and my political views actually sharply move in different directions. Because sometimes I'll argue something is economically inefficient, but then I'll also argue I still think we should morally do it. And I think that is
Yeah.
because I am not, admittedly, I don't know if you are, but I'm not a utilitarian, at least a pure utilitarian. And because of that, that's not inconsistent for me to believe. But it's also a wholly reasonable thing, right? I can have views about what we should morally do, but the facts say one thing and my moral views say another thing, and facts and morals are not the same thing. And that's fine. And I think when it comes to these sorts of things, when, like, for example, someone like me mentions cohesion, they probably will make assumptions about what I believe. But at the end of the day, I think there's a large national interest in cohesion in that if you look at states or nations or whatever your preferred term is over long periods of time, they fall apart when they become uncohesive because they're not able to face any external threat, nor can they deal with any internal threat because they're more concerned with fighting over themselves than in dealing with the external problem. And I think when we do this, it actually, for people that like democracy, it really endangers democracy because it gives ammo to all the people who are opposed to democracy to begin with. Like I was reading Thomas Hobbes recently, and he's a famous monarchist, right? And one thing he said about democracy is that democracies faced with no external threat will immediately bicker over each other, and eventually they'll start ignoring every external threat and internal threat because they're so concerned about their differences in opinion that they can never unify. And he said, therefore, monarchy. And I myself don't like monarchy, right? I like democracy. I like the American system. But the thing is, I am concerned that when we do this, we basically undermine the very argument for the system that many people say they value.
Yeah. I think part of it too is we're so censored. Like there's some
Mm-hmm.
people that just drive me insane, and I wish I could pick you up and put you somewhere in like the Middle East or Africa where there's like high violence, like a high violence city or a high violence section, to realize like there's still countries that are actually fighting. There's
Mm-hmm.
still wars that are going on. I mean, I was watching a documentary on World War II, and you go into realizing like what occurred in these places and the crimes that occurred, whether you agree with one side or the other side. I think we have become so complacent that we think like, oh, I hear Americans all the time like, oh, these countries are great, and I really identify with these people, and I'm just like you just don't realize like how good the US really is. I think we lose sight of that kind of because we're bickering amongst each other like, oh well, let's argue over our identity politics or taxes, and we fail to see that there are much larger, I think, global threats than we've kind of been told, I guess, in the last, I don't know, 20 years here.
Yeah, and I think Americans' loathing for themselves is pretty intense. So my wife is from China, right? So she's not from America. And one thing I told her, and she didn't believe me initially until she stayed here for a bit, was that no one hates Americans more than Americans. And that's really concerning, right? You go to a place, India, they have their issues, they fight internally, right? But they still fundamentally love their country and want what's best for it. And at the end of the day, they'll still unite when it push comes to shove, right? And I'm not so confident America is there anymore. I'm just not. And I think many people, when it comes to the comparing it to other countries, I've called this the study abroad effect, which is wherever someone studied abroad, they think the America should be that country. And it's not because they've actually looked at any data. It's almost always because they have a romanticized view of that country. And when you ask people from that country how things are, it is a very different experience. So I had a friend who studied in France. He thinks America should be exactly like France. France is perfect. And then I sent him like what's going on with the elections and stuff. And he's like, oh, yeah. And I'm like, yeah. That was like, it was literally like text. There's oh, and then yeah. And I was like, see, like I don't think people actually deal with the reality of countries. They deal with the romanticized view of what they experience instead
Mhm.
of the reality of living in them. And because of that, I think many people tend to look down on the U.S. And if anyone says the U.S. has problems, I will be the first to criticize them. And there's a lot, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily the worst country in the whole world.
Yeah, definitely. Do you want to talk about your book? You have a second book out. Is it already out?
No, it's not out yet.
Oh
It's
man.
coming out.
Let's
Yeah.
talk about it then. Do you have a second book coming out? Do
Mm-hmm.
you have a date set yet or no?
No. So it's on a. So the book is about nominal income targeting. So this is a very niche topic to begin with, but I think it's very important because the Fed has actually considered it as one of their policies. The essence of the idea is instead of targeting inflation like they currently do, they will target a rate of nominal GDP growth. So what we would just often call GDP growth,
Mhm.
and they'll just try to hit a rate of 4% a year, irrelevant if it's inflationary or irrelevant if it's driven by real growth. And many people that I like, including Austrians, as you mentioned, have actually endorsed this policy. And am someone who, as you know, I literally had a professor who was an Austrian economist. So I understand their perspective. I understand what they're saying. I have come to the policy because not because on a theoretical level, but I believe on an empirical level, it is incorrect. And I think there's overwhelming data to oppose such a policy for monetary policy. And yet it's gaining a lot of traction because it happens to appeal to people from many different schools of thought. And it follows kind of the same joke that politics does, right? Which it's when both parties agree, I'm concerned, right? And it's the same kind of logic. When they all agree on this, I'm actually concerned. And what I argue for in the book is basically that I think this policy of trying to hit a GDP number, irrelevant of how we hit the GDP number, is a dangerous policy. It's an inflationary policy. And I would rather us adopt a policy in which we try to maintain a stable price level over a very long period of time.
I gotcha. Say, I am very against. I have thought about it, and I don't have a full consensus of why, but I do not like that we target inflation rates. It drives me insane. I'm like, because everyone always goes, it's 2% inflation. And I'm like, but why? Why is it not 1% inflation? Why isn't it negative? That just encourages savings. And perhaps, I mean, to the Keynesian argument we've been making here, if maybe we've overspent and we're credibly overextended. Maybe we should try to have a deflationary period where everybody is encouraged to save. Yes, GDP will come down, the economy will slow, but it's like then we can at least come to a stable point of having less, less debt. But the only way to do that's to save, and the only way to do that, I think, is to come to a deflationary state. But I always think it's odd that we set like a target. Like we must be, like we need to plan. We need to tell everyone how to do this instead of just, I think, stepping back more so from a stability stance, just looking at the economy and saying it's doing its thing. The machine is running. Maybe we shouldn't poke and prod it so much, trying to like fine tune and optimize some sort of result out of it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're on the right track. For me, right, I've always said that you can think of it as a thermostat, right? Assuming it's an AC, one that does both AC and heating.
Yeah.
You can have two types of people. One that is the person who comes home, turns it super cold because it was really hot outside, and then decides they're too cold, turns it super hot because now they're too cold, and then keeps doing that all day. And they do that year round. And then there are those people that just want to keep the thermostat at a nice temperature year round. And because it's one that does AC and heating, it will automatically regulate the temperature. So I like it at 72. If I just keep it at 72 year round. And there are those two types of people. And monetary policy is the exact same way. There's one type of person who wants to keep monetary policy on a rule and say, look, I don't think the Fed should be driving the economy because if I took some random person off the street, put them in the Fed, I wouldn't trust them to run the economy. And then if you told me they had a degree and have been doing this for many years, I still wouldn't trust them to run the economy. Because if you think about it, how much do you think people can tangibly articulate all the sectors in the economy if you ask them credibly to not just give broad definitions, like they can't just say technology, but to name like all the major products in the economy? No one can do that. Not the Fed chair, not the anything. But we believe they are fully competent to run the economy and direct it in the exact way to hit the optimal outcome. And I would say the optimal strategy is not to try to move the economy. It goes down, we try to push it up. It goes up, we try to push it down. Instead, just keep a flat rule that we stick to, irrelevant of where the economy is going. And I think there's really strong empirical evidence to support this, which is if you look at history, often when we have crises, the Fed's response tends to be in the wrong direction first, and then only later they move in the right direction. And if we can't consistently see them making the right decision, I don't see why we should give them discretion. Instead, I think it'd just be better to have a rule. And I think you prefer a slightly deflationary rule. I prefer a rule at which it's just zero over long periods of time. So we'll have some deflation some year, some inflation some year. But on net, we'll try to keep it around 0%, such that my dollar 100 years from now is worth the same as my dollar today. And at the end of the day, I think that is a more reasonable policy as opposed to what we currently do.
Have you ever thought about pegging the dollars to population? Because I always hear the
No,
argument.
that's interesting.
Oh, I've thought about this. So
Yeah.
to your point, right? I think that I think we are so overinflated because we've had such inflation for so many years. We need to be in a negative inflationary state. But I think to your point, a zero would make the most sense. But I also think we should just let it bounce. But one of the arguments that's been made when I've mentioned this is people say, well, what if the population grows? Which it does. And as the population grows, if there's a set amount of dollars, right, we're going to have deflation just automatically because we have more people. And so everyone's like, so we need to now target a 2% rate and then they make all the rules up what they want to do. I think it'd make more sense if that's your actual argument in case that someone has made. Why not just link like X amount of US dollars per X amount of people?
Mm-hmm.
And then they come up with, look at it like maybe annually and they make some sort of adjustment. They say, okay, we're behind by I don't know, $50 million. And then they slowly release $50 million over the next 12 months and then make the adjustments the next year. I don't know if that would help get to that zero state because now
Hmm.
we're not seeing deflation pressure for the population's not going to impact it. Also, then you don't see as much spending because people don't realize now, like, I want to spend more money. So I'll just, create more money so I can spend more money.
So my live reaction to this, which is not data driven right now, just based on data I've seen prior, is that I think concept is very interesting, but I would be concerned because I think if you're aiming for deflation, that's what that would cause, but it wouldn't maintain the stability of the price level. And the reason I'm certain about this is because the growth rate, if the growth rate exceeds the growth rate of the money supply for a specific period of time, there will be deflation automatically, and
Mhm.
the population tends to grow much slower than that. And so lead to a persistent rate of deflation. And I think it'd be concerning given that, as you probably know, our birth rates are down in the United States
Yeah.
and they continue to decline. And I think that would lead to a slower growth. But even though that's happening, our GDP growth rate's actually been still, remarkably resilient given that. And so I think pegging it to the growth rate would be better. But the reason I think that's harder is because we don't know what the growth rate is until after the fact. So what I've favored is what Milton Friedman called like the K% rule, which is we have a certain percent we increase the money supply. You'll say like 3% or 2%, whatever your favorite number is. And we try to target that rate to what the average growth rate is over the 10 years or what we expect that to be over the 10 years. And then we increase that. So let's say one year we come at 3%. If it's like a 2.5% rate, we'll have a little bit of deflation. But then if it's 2% the next year, we'll have a little bit of inflation. But over a very period of time, we'd expect it to be roughly zero.
Okay. I
Yeah.
gotcha. So essentially, the argument is technology would outpace population growth.
Yeah.
It's definitely concerning now because to your point, we are shrinking, which
Mm-hmm.
is a whole other problem.
Yeah, unfortunately, technology moves a lot faster than population growth historically, as far as I have seen. Over the last like 100 years, it moves drastically faster. And so, and we also go, technology goes like this. It's like leaps as opposed to kind of like a flat trend line. And given that, yeah, I think it's just, I think it'd be too slow if it was population. But if we were aiming for consistent deflation, that would definitely do the job.
Awesome. Well, CR, I think we've come up past an hour here. So it was great
Yeah.
to have you on. Any final words for the listeners on advice on economics, books to read? I mean, we've mentioned a bunch here. I'm like, in my head, I'm thinking I'm going to go back and rewatch this and then take some notes. But
Yeah, I don't have any particular book to read. I just always encourage people to educate themselves, really dive into the subject material. Because I promise you, no matter how boring you think economics is, there will be a part of it that you find interesting. I've never found one person that's found all of economics boring. And I'd also just say that in terms of economic competency, always be humble. I've said a bunch of things here, and there's a chance I'm wrong. I'm very frequently wrong. I'm a human, right? And I'd say always be humble, always do your own research, and don't ever assume you know everything because I promise you, there will be a study that contradicts your current views.
yeah, awesome. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Dimitri.